All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going to tackle a really critical piece of the National Electrical Code. We're talking Section 210.19. Now this is all about sizing the wires that, power our entire world. And trust me, getting this right is the difference between a totally safe installation and a really serious hazard.
So, here's what we've got on tap. First, we're going to look at the why behind all this, the hidden danger this code is designed to stop. Then we'll dig into the core safety rule. From there, we'll see how it all plays out with your everyday outlets, those super power-hungry kitchens, and other loads. And finally, we'll wrap it all up into a nice, clear safety blueprint.
So, why on earth is there an entire section of the code just dedicated to how thick a wire needs to be? Well, it's because the real issue isn't just about making sure the lights turn on, it's about preventing the dangers you can't even see.
Just think about that for a second. With any electrical system, what's that one invisible threat that every single rule, every proper installation is designed to prevent?
Yep, it's heat. It's as simple as that. You see, whenever current flows through a wire, it creates heat. And if that wire is too skinny for the amount of juice you're pushing through it, well, it can get way too hot, melt its insulation, and suddenly you've got a massive fire risk on your hands. That's why the code is so obsessed with the math. It's all about stopping that from ever happening. And that brings us right to the bedrock principle of sizing conductors, the core rule that really governs so many of our calculations. It all circles around one key idea, the continuous load.
So, what in the world is a continuous load? Well, the NEC is super clear about this. It's any piece of equipment, any system, that's going to be pulling its maximum power for 3 hours or even longer. And believe me, that distinction is absolutely crucial. To put it into real-world terms, a non-continuous load is something you flip on for a little bit, right? Like a vacuum cleaner or maybe a blender. But a continuous load, that's the stuff that runs for hours and hours. Think about the lights in an office building or an electric water heater. That sustained, long-term operation is where the heat really builds up.
And to handle all that heat, the code gives us the 125% rule. This is key. You don't just size the wire for the load itself. You size it for 125% of the continuous load. That extra capacity is basically a safety buffer, making sure the wire can take that sustained heat without breaking a sweat.
So let's break down how you actually do the math. It's a really simple 4-step process. First up, you figure out your continuous load in amps. Step 2, you multiply that by 1.25. Then, step 3, you add in any non-continuous loads on that same circuit, and boom, what you're left with is your minimum ampacity. That's just a fancy word for how much current your wire needs to be able to handle safely.
Okay, so that's the big rule. But what about all those normal branch circuits? The ones feeding all the regular outlets you see all over a house. Well, the code has a specific, and actually a much simpler rule for those.
Yeah, this one's a breeze. If you've got a branch circuit on a 20-amp breaker that's feeding a bunch of outlets, the wire you use has to be rated for at least 20 amps. A 15-amp circuit, you need 15-amp wire. The wire just has to match the breaker. It's really that simple.
Now, let's head into the kitchen, because that's where you'll find some of the biggest power hogs in a modern home. The code actually singles out things like electric ranges, because, man, their loads are just huge.
And the rule here is totally direct. There is zero wiggle room. If you are installing a standard electric range that's rated at 8.75 kilowatts or higher, that circuit has to be, at a minimum, 40 amps. Period. So you can see this really clear line in the sand. That 8.75 kilowatt number is the trigger. The second you go over it, boom, you're automatically in 40 amp circuit territory. For any smaller appliances that fall below that line, you just go back to the standard rules. Match the wire to the load and the breaker. Okay, so we've hit continuous loads, we've hit multi-outlet circuits, and we've hit kitchen ranges. What about everything else? Well, this is where the code's catch-all rule comes into play. And it's got a couple of really important exceptions.
For most other general stuff like your lighting fixtures, the rule basically sets a floor. The wire's got to be big enough for the load, sure, but it can never ever be smaller than 14-gauge wire. That's 14 AWG. This just sets a baseline safety standard for everything else.
Now, even though that 14-gauge rule's the standard, the code does have these little exceptions for what it calls tap conductors. These are very specific cases where a smaller wire is okay, but only for a really short distance. For example, those short little wires coming right out of a light fixture, they can be smaller, but only if they're less than 18 inches long. So just think of these as very specific, very limited exceptions to the main rule. All right, so we've walked through the biggest pieces of Section 210.19. Let's step back for a second and put all these rules together into a kind of safety blueprint that makes sense.
So, let's recap the big ideas. The 125% rule, that's your #1 defense against heat from stuff that runs all the time. For your everyday outlets, it's easy. Wire matches the breaker. Big kitchen ranges need at least a 40-amp circuit. And for almost everything else, 14 gauge is your starting point. You see? Every single one of these rules points back to the exact same goal: stop things from overheating and catching fire.
You know, when you boil it all down, the super dense language of the code is really just a detailed instruction manual for safety. It's a whole system designed to keep the incredible power that's flowing through our walls controlled, predictable, and, most importantly, safe. So the real question is, how are you going to use this blueprint to make sure the systems you work on are as safe as they can possibly be?